Now, there's just one more day to go until the U.S. presidential election. One of the key issues in this election is the conflict in the Middle East. Now, Malik Fouda looks at the candidates' approach to the conflicts and hears from people who are the most affected.
On Tuesday, Americans will decide on their next president. More than 240 million are eligible to vote. And according to the New York Times, some 75 million already have, casting their ballots early. Their options are a return to a familiar face in re-electing Donald Trump, or take a chance on the sitting Vice President Kamala Harris, who's chairing the Democratic ticket. It's too tight to call, with neither of them polling a comfortable lead. A big ticket item for many voters are the candidates' views on the wars in Gaza and Lebanon, and plans to end them. Trump and Harris are well aware.
You're going to have peace in the Middle East, but not with the clowns that you have running the U.S. right now.
As president, I will do everything in my power to end the war in Gaza, to bring home the hostages, end the suffering in Gaza, ensure Israel is secure, and ensure the Palestinian people can realize their right to dignity, freedom, security, and self-determination.
And on the ground in Tel Aviv, the public sentiment is just as polarized as the U.S.
I would prefer to have a woman as the leader of the United States. I think it could be a change for the better, and I hope she's elected.
I'm thinking of Donald Trump. He has proven himself. Even last time he was the president of the United States, he helped Israel a lot. With Jerusalem, with the Golan Heights. We all wish, he would get elected.
But Palestinians, who've suffered unspeakable atrocities for more than a year, remain pessimistic.
The American elections will not affect the war in any way and will not have an impact. It may affect the American voter, but not the Palestinian citizen. The Americans are a partner in the war in Gaza and in the extermination of children, women, and the elderly.
And they have reasons to doubt the candidate's promises.
Biden spent 4 years and did not provide anything for the Palestinian people. He was promising a two-state solution, and in the end there is no state solution or anything. Even in the war, all he talked about is the hostages. What about the people who are dying?
The U.S. president can end the bloodshed. They're the last line of authorization for any weapons transfers to Israel. The Biden administration alone transferred more than $50 billion worth of weapons to Tel Aviv this year. Many people around the world are hoping that whoever occupies the Oval Office next will make decisions that protect human lives above everything else. Malik Fouda, TRT World.
Now let's go live to Washington, D.C., where we have Selena Downs live for us. Selena, lots of different polls now, but it does appear to be very, very close between the two candidates, right?
Absolutely, yes. These polls are deadlocked going into the final day of campaigning here in the U.S. It's one of the tightest elections we've seen on record, particularly in those key swing states. No one candidate has a substantial margin over the other, and it really is too tight to call. There was an interesting poll that came out of Iowa, the state of Iowa, over the weekend, which has the Democrats and Kamala Harris's team quite excited because it put her 3 points ahead of Donald Trump in the state of Iowa, which, if correct, would be unheard of. Iowa has voted for Donald Trump every time he's been on the ballot, but this poll, coming from a highly respected pollster, has her 3 points ahead, and that is largely because the polls are suggesting women are coming out to vote in large numbers for Kamala Harris, and not just young women who have been rallied by the abortion issue, but also older women who feel that their rights are being eroded under Donald Trump, or were eroded under Donald Trump during his first presidency. But the polls are really deadlocked, particularly in those key swing states which these candidates have to win over voters in, the likes of Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Kamala Harris is campaigning in Pennsylvania today, the final day of her campaigning. She knows she has to win over that state. It's key to her race for the White House. It flip-flopped back and forth over previous presidential elections. It voted for Obama in 2008, 2012. It voted for Donald Trump in 2016. 2016, but then it went back to Joe Biden in 2020. Kamala Harris is going to be hoping to hold that state for the Democrats. It holds 19 electoral votes. She needs that state in her path to the White House. It really is key to her election campaign. But yes, too tight to call for now. Nobody is willing to stick their necks out. It's a deadlocked race, and we won't know until well after the polls close on Tuesday night.
Selena, you're there in the Capitol now. How are people preparing for Election Day there?
I think it's actually fair to say that quite a lot of Americans are feeling really anxious about this election. Certainly voters we spoke to at early polling centres over the weekend are saying this feels like one of the most divisive elections in recent memory. They feel like the principles America was founded on, liberty, justice, freedom and democracy, are really under threat in this election. Some of them told us that, they're too scared to put banners supporting one candidate out on their front lawn because they're worried about fear and retribution from opposing camps. And that's largely down to the bitter vitriol and the rhetoric that is coming out of these campaigns, both campaigns and their messaging. Donald Trump increasingly using dark and dystopian language. Kamala Harris is painting him as unhinged and unstable going into the final days of these campaigns. And people are being bombarded on social media and on television around town just with, really attacking, combative messages from both sides. You can see behind me that, some businesses are taking the opportunity to board up their businesses. They're really fearing potential violence if the election doesn't go the way of one particular camp. Election violence like we saw in the Capitol on January the 6th, 2021, when supporters of Donald Trump refused to accept the election result and they stormed the Capitol building just a few blocks from us here. And people are worried that if Kamala Harris does win or is declared the winner on Tuesday night, they're worried or they fear that perhaps supporters of Donald Trump won't accept that election result again.
Selena Downs, thank you so much for that report from Washington, D.C. And supporters of Donald Trump have gathered outside of his home in Florida. Now, our North America correspondent John Brain caught up with some of them to ask about their mood ahead of the election.
Well, this is the scene outside Mar-a-Lago, which, of course, is Donald Trump's base. People have been here for several hours now, trying to attract the traffic with their flags and their banners. Let's see if we can talk to some of them. Excuse me, can I ask you who you're voting for?
Oh, let's think about it. It's not a hard guess. It's Donald Trump, baby.
And why?
Why? Why not? 4 years of this BS that's been going on, we don't need another 4 years. We need Trump back in office, make those changes. We need change, and he's the one who's going to be able to do it for all of us.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Let's move along here. Why are you voting for Donald Trump?
Like he said, why not? A better economy. We want a better economy. I want to be able to afford groceries. I'm tired of the bills being so high, expensive.
You're not worried about his perceived character defects, that he's a bit rude and bullying?
I'm not going to dinner with him. I'm not going on a date with him. Who cares? Well, I need somebody strong and fearless that can protect all of us. I don't care if he makes some silly comment.
Do you think he's going to win?
Absolutely. Sure, yes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed. Well, an optimistic message from the Trump supporters. Of course, the Kamala Harris supporters are feeling the same way as well. For now, though, back to you.
Now, the violence in the Middle East may be dominating many of the headlines ahead of tomorrow's U.S. election, but depending on who wins, the implications for Ukraine could be even more significant. TRT World's Joe Flynn has more.
We make it clear we stand with Ukraine now and in the future.
Joe Biden may have meant those words when he said them in September. The man sitting next to him would have wanted to believe them. The likelihood is there are probably few people in the world outside America more worried about the US election than Volodymyr Zelensky. And for good reason. There's much at stake for the Ukrainian president, with Donald Trump and Kamala Harris offering starkly different visions of how to end the war with Russia. In particular, Zelensky and many in his country are worried about the prospect of Trump taking office after he'd promised to halt the conflict with a phone call to Vladimir Putin. Trump's affinity for the Russian president is widely documented and highlighted again during the Republican candidate's meeting with Zelensky in September.
We have a very good relationship. And I also have a very good relationship, as you know, with President Putin. And I think if we win, I think we're going to get it resolved very quickly. very worried. I really think we're going to get it.
I hope we have more good relations.
We're going to have, oh, I see. Yeah, but you know, it takes two to tango.
Trump himself has been vague with details about what exactly his phone call or plan would entail. The suspicion is it would likely have key differences to Zelensky's victory plan.
Talking to Donald Trump, I told him what is the way out. Either Ukraine will have nuclear weapons and then this is defense for us, or we should have some kind of an alliance. Today, we do not know any effective alliances other than NATO.
Although Zelensky's body language didn't appear much warmer during his meeting with Kamala Harris, her policies align more closely with Kyiv's.
There are some in my country who would instead force Ukraine to give up large parts of its sovereign territory, who would demand that Ukraine accept neutrality and would require Ukraine to forego security relationships with other nations. These proposals are the same of those of Putin.
The Harris presidency would also, however, look to prevent escalation of the war into a direct confrontation with Russia. That has the potential to hamper Kyiv's fight. Zelensky has appeared aware of the role played by US lawmakers in this too, especially after congressional Republicans held up a vital aid package earlier this year. Some have called for an end to this financial aid. Though the issue is a talking point at rallies, including Donald Trump's, popular support for Ukraine across the US suggests most feel differently. A poll by Brookings in August suggested Americans across the political spectrum were sympathetic with Ukraine. Zelensky, like many others here, is aware that the last 2.5 years of war have taken their toll on Ukraine's allies, which raises questions about their support going forwards. How their scars have healed may prove to be as significant for Ukraine's future as its own. Joel Flynn, TRT World in Kyiv.
And Joel is live for us now from Kyiv. Good to see you, Joel. We heard there Donald Trump telling Zelensky it takes two to tango. But let's talk about the people of Ukraine, though. Are they as well? Are they also worried about a potential Donald Trump victory?
I think Ukrainians are very anxious about what the outcome of this election to be. There is an incredibly large amount at stake for them, possibly even the ultimate amount, which is the future of their country. When you talk to Ukrainians in the street, they're worried about the prospect of Trump ultimately enforcing a peace that doesn't favor them, that may involve them giving up the large swathes of their country that the Russians currently occupy. Certainly, that seemed to be the impression that Trump has given over the last couple of years when he's talked about Ukraine, and he hasn't talked favorably too about American support for the Ukrainians either. Indeed, earlier this year, he called Volodymyr Zelensky the greatest salesman in history, saying that every time he turned up in Washington, he walked away with $60 billion. The Ukrainians still feel that US financial aid isn't enough. So Zelensky will not only be worried about the prospect of Trump winning the presidency, he will also be worried about Republicans taking control of the Senate potentially, and what that could mean for the United States' future support for him.
So what about a Kamala Harris win? Would that make a big difference for Ukraine?
It is the better of the two options for Zelensky and for the Ukrainians, but it still doesn't come without its problems. Kamala Harris has talked about essentially continuing the Biden administration's policies on Ukraine. But as I mentioned in that report, there are still issues that the Ukrainians feel are fundamentally undermining their fight against Russia. Primarily, of course, the withholding of support to use long-range missiles inside Russian targets, but also NATO membership. The United States under Biden has opposed the Ukrainians joining NATO. The suspicion is that Kamala Harris would continue to do so as well. And without that, Volodymyr Zelensky feels that the Ukrainians won't be able to ultimately guarantee not only that they can continue their war against Russia, that they can continue to defend their sovereignty, their own country, but also that they might not be able to be able to defend the country in the long term against a future Russian incursion, even if they do figure out a way to try and to make some sort of peace.
Now, we've heard about Zelensky's so-called victory plan, and that does include, like you mentioned, additional weapons being stationed in Ukraine as sort of a deterrence. But, depending on whatever happens here in the U.S. election, we're talking about territory, we're talking about money, and, of course, arms. Is that sort of the key issue here, the weapons being sent from the U.S.? I believe we may have lost connection there to Joel Flynn, but that is Joel Flynn live for us in Kiev. Let's move over to Moscow now instead, where we have Dasha Chernysova. She joins us live there. Dasha, good to see you. We heard there in Joel's report about how people are quite anxious in Ukraine about the outcome of this election. Now, of course, Vladimir Putin, he said recently that his favorite was Joe Biden. But, you know, now, of course, Joe Biden is no longer in the race. It's a race between Harris and Trump. So what would you say is at stake here for Russia in this election?
Well, indeed, there was a lot at stake for Russia in this election, and the Kremlin, although said that officially it doesn't really change the course of the relations between Moscow and Washington, no matter who takes the Oval Office, it is still watching the outcome of this election. And we do know that the Russian president has been making some comments saying that indeed the Democratic candidate would be more predictable, as that would certainly be the continuation of the current line. But keep in mind that over the past years, the relations have turned to the lowest point in history. They have soured under the Obama administration. They got worse under Trump, and they are falling apart now under the Biden administration. But to discuss this further as to what's at stake and what we can expect with the new U.S. president in office, I'm joined by Dmitry Babich. He is the deputy foreign editor at Komsomolskaya Pravda Daily. Dmitry, what's your view at what's at stake here and what the next presidency of the new U.S. president will look like when it comes to the relations with Russia?
Well, I think there will be two levels in the Russian reaction, in the reaction of Russian officials. There is a public level and there is a real, pragmatic level. On the public level, unfortunately, our officials have to keep in mind the schizophrenic, paranoid attitude to Russia and to its attitude to this election on the American side and on the European side. If our president or if someone from the Kremlin says that we support Trump, they're going to say, aha, here's what we told you, he is a Russian puppet, all these stupidities. So if we say that we support Kamala, they will say that this is some sort of a game. So publicly there is neutrality and absence of hope. But on the pragmatic level, I think we still hope for a diplomatic solution for the Ukrainian conflict. We still hope to have at some point normalized relations with the United States. And in that sense, we don't want anyone's victory, we want a defeat. We want a defeat of the ideology that polarized American society, that made us quarrel with Ukraine. When so many people ask how come that Russians and Ukrainians who are so close to each other, how come we are killing each other, I will respond, who in the United States cared about transsexuals or single-sex family 20 or 30 years ago? And now people are ready to kill each other on these issues. So what we want is the disappearance of this ideology that polarizes people, polarizes society, splits society, and turns it into a chaotic mess.
So how soon do you think we could be talking about the negotiated settlement for the conflict in Ukraine? We know that one of the candidates said that could be over in a matter of just days. Do you think it is the case? And with the new president in office, we will be talking about it soon?
A few days is not a realistic perspective. But on the other side, from Kamala, we don't have even promise of peace, She keeps talking about the necessity of Ukrainian victory, so there's absolute absence of hope on that track. From Trump, we have no illusions about him. He is a redneck, very, very, very unpleasant kind of person. But we still hope that pragmatic forces inside American society and inside Ukrainian society will finally start operating and will come to some sort of a compromise. It will not depend on the person. It will depend on the changes inside American society, American political system, European society, and inside Ukrainian society too.
And what about the help for Ukraine? We know that it is one of the issues that Moscow says is driving the conflict in Ukraine. Do you expect any change with regards to Ukraine being provided with more aid and Russia or less aid, and Russia also changing some of its positions when it comes to the negotiated settlements?
Well, the problem is that defeating Russia, even with the aid from the United States and from Europe, is not realistic. We will not give up our 2 million people in Crimea. We will defend them. You may send missiles, tanks, helicopters. We will defend them. And for that reason, it just makes no sense to waste all of these hundreds of billions of dollars on nothing. So I hope American society will realize this, and it will pressure politicians, no matter who is in the White House. We hope that society, the Congress, will pressure the politicians into a more pragmatic line.
And how realistic is it to see the normalization of ties between Moscow and Washington on the wider level? Because we also know that they are holding strategic security negotiations, and there are many issues on which the cooperation, or at least some normal dialogue between Moscow and Washington, is needed. How soon can that be achieved, and what's needed?
Well, what's needed is the defeat of the ultra-liberal ideology now ruling the United States and the European Union. Because if you look for the reasons for the conflict, they are not material, they are not economic, they're ideological. It made no sense to destroy Nord Stream project. It was a good project for everyone, including even Poland. We had a pipeline going through Poland, and it was wasted because of ideology. There were no material reasons for that. So the sooner this ideology is defeated, the sooner we will have normalization of ties. It does not depend on a single person in the White House. It does not depend on some kind of development in economy or even on the battlefield. It depends on structural changes inside Western society, because our society remained the same since the 90s. We are still peaceful people.
What about NATO? Do you see any further rhetoric from the NATO countries when it comes to further enlargement, or perhaps something that's going to irritate Moscow?
Well, the problem is that the bigger the organization, the less hope there is for normalization. Because, okay, the United States is a country. You have the Congress, you have the president, you have people who elect in one way or another their government. The EU officials are not elected. There is no direct link between them and the voters. With NATO, it's the same situation. So if you look at hostility comes from these unelected bureaucrats. General Secretary of NATO, European officials, they're usually the most aggressive ones. Borrell said that Western countries should allow Ukraine to use their missiles deep into Russian territory. In that sense, Mr. Borrell, that European is less of a pacifist than President Biden, an American. So in that sense, I have little hope for organizations. I have more hope for people and for individual governments coming to their senses.
From the economic point of view, we have seen Donald Trump, as he was previously the president, introducing the most sanctions against Russia. That was one of those instances where Russia has, and Russians also have lost hope and said that doesn't make much difference, no matter who is the president in the U.S. Kamala Harris, on the other hand, we've heard the Russian president saying that she's laughing, and that is probably the sign that she is doing fine and there could be no more sanctions. On the economic front, does it make difference who will be president for Russia?
Well, economically, it makes sense to make peace between our two countries, and not only between our two countries, but between Russia and the West, global South and the West. It all makes sense economically, but the West doesn't want it. So that's the problem. But I would not lose hope. There are certain changes. Trump now controls the Republican Party. That was not the case in 2016, 2017. Kamala Harris, I hope she throws out the team that she inherits from Biden and from Obama. I hope it won't be the fourth Obama turn, because these people mistreated her. They didn't respect her when she was the vice president. So I hope she ousts them all.
So hope is something that is the last to die, as we say in Russia. And let's see who wins the Oval Office. But in Russia, certainly this is being watched, even though the officials are trying to remain pragmatic.
Dasha Chernysova live for us from Moscow. Thank you so much for that report, Dasha. The upcoming U.S. presidential election will, of course, have wide-ranging global implications, especially for Ukraine, as the country is heavily reliant on U.S. support to sustain its defense against Russia. From F-16 fighter jets to Patriot missile defense systems, the U.S. has been Ukraine's chief supplier of weapons, providing more than $64 billion in military assistance since the start of the war. Kamala Harris, she's condemned Vladimir Putin's brutality and his tactics and will most likely continue President Biden's support policy for Ukraine. Harris says that U.S. support is essential, warning that Putin's ambitions could extend far beyond Ukraine. Now, Donald Trump, on the other hand, he's been very critical of American aid to Ukraine. He claims that he could end the conflict by bringing both sides to the negotiating table, though he hasn't explained how. Many are now concerned about what a Trump victory could mean for Ukraine, as they fear he could take a softer approach towards Russia. Now, let's bring in Alex Cadier, who's in Brussels for us. Alex, talk to us about the conversation there in Brussels regarding this upcoming election. What does it sound like?
Well, there's absolutely a lot of intense interest, both in the case of EU officials here at the European Council, across the street, the European Commission, but also NATO officials also headquartered here in Brussels. But for ordinary citizens, you hear it every day. Some people are going to stay up through the night to watch the results. They feel like this could have a serious impact on Europe, and that's why there is so much interest. You could almost be forgiven for thinking this was a domestic election because of the level of interest you see across Europe in this election. Now, let's break down, particularly when it comes to those EU officials, what that might mean, why there is so much interest. Well, they feel like the outcome could have a very different impact if it's the former President Trump or Vice President Harris winning the election, particularly when it comes to security, when it comes to the NATO alliance. But on trade, that is a big concern. We heard Maroš Šefčovič, the incoming trade commissioner of the European Commission, saying he is willing to work in a spirit of cooperation with whoever wins the election. But Donald Trump has said he may put a 10% or 20% tariff on all imports coming into the United States. Big fear there is that could trigger a trade war with the European Union, and that could have a very, very big impact indeed. That Trump presidency seen in Europe, seen in Brussels as a slightly more disruptive outcome on security, certainly because Donald Trump has said he may not come to the aid of NATO countries that are attacked if they don't pay enough into the alliance. So that impact will be felt across Europe. There is a real concern. But on trade in particular, that's not to say that a Harris administration is being seen as a El Dorado, as a wonderful outcome for Europe. We will almost certainly see more protectionist measures. They just see Kamala Harris as someone they can work with far more than Donald Trump.
So would you say that there's an actual worry now among the European and NATO officials for the possible outcome of this election, or is it mainly sort of just a wait-and-see game to see who actually wins the White House?
Well, publicly, there doesn't seem to be a worry. Officially, there doesn't seem to be much worry. Maroš Šefčovič, as I said, saying he can work in a spirit of cooperation with anybody, either of the candidates, if they were to get elected. We heard from Mark Rutte, the new Secretary General of NATO, saying he's not worried about the outcome of this election. Behind the scenes, however, there is quite a bit of concern, particularly when it comes to security, when it comes to Ukraine. This claim by former President Trump that he would have the war resolved in 24 hours has raised a lot of eyebrows, because they assume that means giving away bits of Ukrainian territory to Russia, which makes European officials feel like European countries might be next if Vladimir Putin is emboldened by those negotiations. Also, if the United States rolls back on its security in Europe, on its presence in Europe, that would mean the European Union and European countries have to step in. They're not yet in the position to do that, and he has threatened, as we've said, not to come to the aid of countries paying enough into the NATO alliance. All of these things are very concerning. The argument from Jens Stoltenberg, the outgoing Secretary General of NATO, is, well, you have to be careful with Trump. Sometimes he says some things when he's campaigning, but when he's in office, it's a slightly different concern. When it comes to security, certainly Kamala Harris is seen as the continuity candidate for Europe, a candidate that is more predictable, more reliable, someone they can work with. But whatever the outcome, whoever gets elected, the impact will be felt here in Brussels and across Europe.
Alex Cadier, live for us from Brussels. Thank you so much, Alex.